Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar tonight. We are going to be focusing on nutrition for the gut microbiome. My name is Gemma. I'm a registered nutritionist and a health coach at Second Nature, and I'm going to be joined by Marianne tonight, who is also a registered nutritionist. And we are going to be sharing some of our top tips for managing your gut microbiome with nutrition. And then at the end, we will have time to go through a Q&A with our lovely Zara, who is also a registered associate nutritionist and a health coach. But before we get into it, I kind of just wanted to explain why Marianne and I decided to do this topic, because for me personally, I think gut health and understanding gut health is an absolute game changer in so many aspects of our health. And really, I think it can get very sciencey sometimes, but really just breaking it down and getting into the nitty-gritty bits of, what can we actually do to support our mental and physical well-being can have a huge impact. So for me, understanding the nutrients that we can provide the body with in order to support our gut health and have a healthy gut microbiome is just, the best kind of thing that you can do for yourself. How about you, Marianne?
Yeah, I love talking about this topic because it's really what brought me to nutrition in the first place. I was actually studying forensic science at the time, and I was like 19, 20, and I felt awful and I had low energy and yeah, just very low motivation and a lot of gut problems. And through changing my diet and kind of focusing on my gut and ways I could improve it, the difference was significant. And really, that led me to changing my entire degree and my entire focus for my career and moving towards nutrition. So, yeah, I feel like I love to kind of give that value and that information to other people to make health improvements because I know firsthand kind of what a difference it made for me. So yeah, super passionate about the topic and looking forward to the webinar.
Love that. Right. Well, let's get into it. So tonight, we're going to cover a few different things. So I'll start off by giving a bit of a background on what the gut microbiome actually is and how this is linked to our health. Then we'll go into some barriers within the current gut microbiome research, and we'll finish up with some practical tips to help you support your gut microbiome going forward, followed by a Q&A at the end. But before I tell you a bit more about the gut microbiome, I wanted to share a little bit about Second Nature, who we are and what we do. So I know a lot of you on this call will be Second Nature members, but some of you may not even know who Second Nature are. So what we are, we help people to change their health and to change their habits within a realistic way. We don't believe in fads. We don't believe in diets or calorie counting. We believe in helping people to make changes that will stick for the long term by making those small behavioral changes over time with the support of a health coach. So if you haven't heard of Second Nature and you would like to find out a little bit more about us, I would recommend reaching out on our website, which is www.secondnature.io. So what is the gut microbiome? It is the million-dollar question. I think in the last few months, especially, there's been a lot of talk about the gut microbiome and what it does, but essentially it's this huge ecosystem that's made up of trillions of microorganisms that live along our digestive tract, so primarily in our large intestine, but some are in our stomach and our small intestine too. And within this, we have many, many different types of microorganisms. And as you'll find out as we go a little bit later on into the presentation, diversity is key because each of these microorganisms play a very key role. So just to put it into context, for each of us, we're carrying about 2 to 3 kilos worth of microorganisms in the body, which is actually, when you think about it, a lot. And when you understand what these different microorganisms do, it is just absolutely fascinating. And there's also a lot of talk between the gut microbiome and the gut microbiota, and they get used interchangeably, but they are very different things. So the microorganisms that live in the gut are the microbiota. And just to give you a bit of an overview of the microbiome versus the microbiota. So with the microbiome itself. So that is the entire ecosystem. So that's the microorganisms, the genes, and the environment in which they create and interact within the gut, whereas the microbiota is the microorganisms themselves, so the bacteria, the viruses, other microbes that live within the digestive tract. So if you hear myself, Marianne, or Zara talking about the microbiome and microbiota, hopefully this will help you to understand the distinction between the two. So now we know what the gut microbiome, gut microbiota are, what and how they link to our health. I think, we need to bring it back to basics and understand that they're there to shape our immune system. From the moment we are born, our gut microbiome is created, and there's so many different areas that can be impacted with this. So when you're born, whether you were born via C-section, who was holding you when you came out, people breathing on you, things like this, it all changes your gut microbiome as a whole. And the thing that's interesting as well, there's been a lot of research into things like twin studies, and even twins have got different gut microbiomes. So again, very interesting. And also the fact that it works with nutrient extraction, metabolic responses, and the way that nutrients are digested. So our gut microbiome helps to produce short-chain fatty acids. This is why fiber is such an important part of the diet. And when we're thinking about those short-chain fatty acids, this is helping to maintain the integrity of the gut wall. And that is exactly what we need to try and protect. And that's one of the key reasons why, getting that fiber and actually maintaining a healthy, balanced diet is so important for things like this. And you might have heard of something called the gut-brain axis. And I think for me personally, as a nutritionist and just a general human being, when I first learned about what the gut-brain axis is, I was like mind blown, because I was like, how can they be so interlinked? But essentially, the brain and the gut are interconnected. It's like a bidirectional link between the brain and the gut, and the majority of the communication goes from the gut to the brain. So around 90% of that communication is going from the gut to the brain, and then the other 10% is going from the brain to the gut. And they're connected via something called a vagus nerve. So if you think about it like a long wire, and you've got a plug at each end, and one end it's going into your amygdala, the other end's going into your adrenals. So at one end you've got like your fear center, the other end you've got your fight or flight. So there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of communication between these two in both a physical and a mental manner. We've got the neurotransmitters that are involved as well, so serotonin and dopamine, but it also impacts the way that we feel on a day-to-day basis, whether that's stress, anxiety, general mood, and then those physical symptoms. So the way as well that our nutrients are delivered in the body and secreted. And yeah, it's just a really, really interesting thing to understand. And it's so closely linked to the gut microbiome that it's important to know what the gut-brain axis is. And then we lead on to the gut feeling, and something that I think we've all experienced. Like, have you ever had, butterflies in your tummy? You think of something and then you automatically get this physical response, or you just have that gut intuition where you just know that something doesn't feel quite right, or something does feel quite right. And our gut has been dubbed as a second brain, and it has been dubbed as this for very, very good reason, because our gut actually works independently. So it's got pretty much its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system. This is in the gastrointestinal tract. And then when you think about our central nervous system, so that's our brain and our spinal cord, when you've got our enteric nervous system, it's just completely separate to this, but yet they're separate, but then they both link together. And you think, well, how does this happen? And no wonder it's having an impact on, the way that we feel and the things that we're doing, because around 90%, again, this is one of the facts that I found absolutely fascinating, that 90% of our serotonin is created in the gut. So 90% of our happy hormone is created in the gut, and then the other 10% is created through the food that we eat. So if you think about the precursor, which is tryptophan, if we pair a source of that, so say like turkey, with a source of complex carbs, so say brown rice, potato, that can help to create serotonin. So a lot going on. And leading into the nocebo effect. So the nocebo effect, when I was looking and researching this, I was like, wow, I can't believe I've never really heard of this before, because we've all heard of the placebo effect. We know that, you know, when they do trials and someone gets given a drug and they think that they're taking the real deal, and then next thing they're not, but they were still having the same symptoms, and they were having better outcomes from taking something that wasn't actually having any sort of physical impact. Just shows how much of a link there is between the way that we think and the way that we feel. And the premise of the nocebo effect is that when we are having negative thoughts, this can have an impact on physical symptoms. So it can have impacts on like IBS symptoms. There was a study that was done last year that looked at psychological distress and perceived stress on gut IBS symptoms. And they found that people who had this psychological distress had worse gut symptoms. And then when they reduced that stress, they actually had better symptoms with their gut. So I think it just goes back to as well, like the way that we think about certain things can completely, okay, let's put it into perspective with coaching. So as a coach, I get 9 times out of 10, I'll get a message in my inbox, and it will be, Gemma, I ate a chocolate bar last night. Gemma, I had a takeaway last night. I feel terrible. I've self-sabotaged. I've done this, I've done that. And people berate themselves so much, and they feel this guilt and they feel this shame and they feel this anxiety about eating something. But what they don't understand is that actually a lot of the time, it's not what you're eating that's going to have a big impact on you. It's probably the narrative and the story that you're telling yourself that is going to have a worse impact on your health, because you think about things like stress. Stress can cause inflammation, which can then cause that like leaky gut when those negative things are getting in, and then that's when we start to have health issues. So yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about pretty much. And while we're on the topic of thinking and what we eat, one of the most interesting studies, I think this is the first study that really made people realize the impact that what we eat can have on the way that we feel, was the SMILES trial. And the SMILES trial used participants who are clinically depressed, and they put them into 2 different groups. So they had one group that was a dietary support group, and then one group that had social support, so like therapy type thing. And the dietary support group followed a MOD-MEDI diet. So it's a modified Mediterranean diet. And the Mediterranean diet in general is quite similar to what we promote at Second Nature. So you've got lots of fibrous foods like your fruit, your veg, your whole grains, your legumes. Then you've got your poultry, your eggs, your fish, that's like your protein, and then your healthy fats in the source of nuts, olive oil, and dairy. So you're getting a lot of different food groups in there. And what they wanted to do over a 12-week period was test the efficacy of this dietary program to see if it would make any difference on the depressive symptoms. And yeah, the results were like, they speak for themselves. If you look at the graph here, after 3 months in the dietary intervention, there was significant change in those who had made these changes to their diet. And a third of the people who were in the dietary group met criteria for remission, which is huge. And you think about 12 weeks, right? 12 weeks in the grand scheme of things is really not that long. So if you can achieve something like that in 12 weeks, what would you achieve in 6 months and onwards? So yeah, I think that this is just a really important study, and it's not to say anything about social support. Like you can see, the social support still definitely had an impact, but when we're comparing both, the dietary intervention had the bigger impact. And again, it just goes back to, we really need to put a focus on the things that we are eating, especially as we know from looking at the gut-brain axis of what we eat can impact the way that we feel. So we've spoken more about the mental side of things, but what about the physical side of things and the role of immune function in our gut health? So our immune system and our gut microbiome work synergistically. They're very, very close together. And without our gut microbiota and those gut bugs, our immune system would be very weak. So again, it goes back to making sure that we've got a big diversity in there. Because when we think about what the immune system is, it's a network of cells, tissues, and organs that help our body to fight infection and disease. And in order to fight infection and disease, we need to be fueling our body, we need to be protecting our body in the way that we can. And the fact that around 70% of our immune tissue is located in the gut, in the gut, is really, really important too. And when we think about when things go wrong, and when I say when things go wrong, it's more about, you know, what are we doing that's not supporting our health and then causing those outcomes that are making us ill. Our gut can become permeable. So permeable is kind of like a sciencey word. You might have heard leaky gut. But if you think about our gut being like the old castle walls, and we want to try and prevent an invasion from happening, when things get into our gut and it's like the invasion is happening, that is when our gut can become permeable. That's when we become ill, and we then get food allergies, autoimmune conditions can occur. And it's not to say that we can't change these things, but it's almost like if you can make some sort of changes before it gets worse, then it's definitely worth focusing on, because not only can it impact you physically, it can impact you mentally as well, because it creates access within our central nervous system in the way that can affect emotion. So when we think about the factors that are impacting this, so diet, as we've said, as I've gone through, diet can have a big impact. It's like those ultra processed foods, trans fats, things that are going to just not support our health in the way that we need to. You know, these things are okay in moderation, but when we're having them all the time and we're not getting those whole foods in, like going back to the Mediterranean diet and focusing on like the fibrous foods, the proteins, you're feeding all of your different bacteria. They all have like different taste buds. So if you're only giving your, if you've got the same foods in your diet all the time, you're feeding the same bacteria all the time. When you've got diversity in your diet, you're feeding these different bacteria, and they can support you with this. So if you, for example, aren't including ones that are going to help with digestion, therefore you might have issues with your digestion. When people are on antibiotics, this is going to have an impact with our like good gut bacteria. There's also research to show now that there's an antibiotic called LGG, and that's recommended to be taken while you're on antibiotics and in the week after, because this can help with our gut microbiome and supporting that too. And with genetic susceptibility, I think the thing that we need to remember here is, you know, we can't change our genes. And sometimes if mum or dad or our grandparents have got this illness, it might mean that, you know, it might be passed on to us. It might not be, but if it is, there's not too much that we can do about that. But what we can do is try to focus on what we can within our control, because when we're thinking about what's within our control, there's probably more that we can do that we don't realize. And this is the whole point of doing webinars like this and educating, because if you can make one tiny change from watching this webinar tonight, then, you know, that could have a huge impact on your health. But essentially, these environmental factors, adding stress into that as well. Stress causes inflammation, that can cause leaky gut, that can make you ill. So you've got your environmental factors, genetic susceptibility, it all leads down into disease. So if we can hit it like head on at the top and try to do what we can to change these things, it can make a big difference. But what I will say, I'm not an immunologist, I'm a nutritionist. And even the people who are like the smartest people in the world, they still get confused by this. It's like an absolutely brilliant thing to learn about, but it's also very, very confusing. And I think it's a very complex system to try and understand how every single thing works, because I think there's more kind of unknowns at this point than knowns. And I think that's the hard part, because research still needs to be done. And, you know, in 5-10 years time, we might be in a very different position than we are right now, but we just need to follow the advice and the guidance and the research that is coming out. So yeah, so overall, I think it's focusing really on those environmental factors and what we can do to support ourselves. So just a little summary here of what we've gone through. So, the gut microbiome, it's home to trillions of different microorganisms. They play a role in all parts of our health, from digestion to absorption of nutrients and supporting our immune system, to the gut-brain axis being that bidirectional communication system, and the microbiome and the immune system working in very complex ways and influencing different things within disease, and with the new research that's coming out and so on and so on. Let's hope in the next few years that we can really understand how to have that personalized nutrition and really understand what is going to work best for us. So that's enough of me talking. I will pass you on to the lovely Marianne, who will go through what the barriers are to the current gut microbiome research.
Thanks so much, Gemma. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Perfect. So as Gemma covered, that while there's a lot that we do know about the gut and its interactions with the rest of the body, I wanted to kind of share some context as to why there is still a lot that we don't know, and what can make it a very difficult area to study when it comes to our health. And one barrier to our understanding is the limitation in the evidence so far into all of the components that make up the microbiome. So when we talk about the microbiome, as I'm sure we've all heard, majority of the research so far has looked into bacterial microbes that exist within our gut, but we also have to consider there is diversity within those microbes themselves, and that can include viral microbes, fungal microbes. So the research that's out there still does need to be extended to look at how all of these microbes that exist within our gut work synergistically, and then how that actually influences our gut and our health overall. I wanted to share an example of looking at a group of viral microbes called bacteriophages that are responsible for killing bacteria within the gut. So a reduction in those type of viruses may leave the gut more susceptible to bacterial infection. And if we look at the chart on the right-hand side there, this is just a summary of some research that has been done into viral microbes. And it's showing that, there are indications that there are alterations in these viral microbes in people with various gut disorders like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease. So, as time goes on, we will hopefully understand these other microbes more and kind of learn about kind of what impact they have on our gut as a whole as evidence starts to kind of build up. Another complication on the next slide is that everyone's gut microbiome is different, and there are many things that can influence that, such as our genetics, as Gemma kind of linked to, the way we're born, if we're breastfed, all those kind of things can influence our gut microbiome. Our diet, of course, as we'll cover in more detail, will determine kind of which microbes thrive in our body. Where we live and the environment around us impacts what microbes we, are contained within our body. Our age, so it's been shown that kind of over years, some microbes reduce in number. Where we travel, if we travel a lot, kind of as part of our jobs or our lives, we will pick up microbes from all those areas. And then frequent drug use as well. So an example, as Gemma touched on, as well as antibiotics. If we have frequent antibiotic use, that's going to impact the microbes that live within our gut. And to give an example of that variation from person to person, this is just some recent research that was presented in a recent study day that I attended. And it was done looking at the anti-inflammatory potential of some bacterial species on various people. So the bottom line there are the individual people that were in this trial, and all the different colors are the different bacterial microbes that were used. And as you can see, for some people, the reaction was very good. That was a high potency for anti-inflammatory response, whereas in other people, it was very little. So I think that study just really kind of gives an overview of the impact that bacteria really much depends on the person receiving it. So the host is just as important as the microbes that you're putting in. And then just to add even more complexity, so I know the slide looks really busy, but I'll just narrow it down. Once you've actually figured out what bacteria are actually present in somebody's gut, you then need to consider what are those bacteria actually doing. And microbes don't have just one metabolic function. In fact, there's several mechanisms that work simultaneously. So some are converted into short-chain fatty acids, into vitamins. Some are responsible for the growth of other microbes. Some compete for nutrients, so you have to take that into account. Some stimulate the endocrine system and the hormonal system. Some stimulate the immune system. And then, as Gemma covered, there's also that communication with the gut-brain axis that they will have an impact on. So I hope that like just really summarizes that it can make it really, really hard to fully understand the total impact on our health when you're looking at a study that is only measuring one specific outcome, because the gut is so complex and there is so many things happening at the same time. It can just make it very difficult to kind of narrow down specific mechanisms of action. And I think, as again, as more and more research comes together and you kind of put all these pieces together of the puzzle, we will slowly start to understand more and more over the coming years. And then, yeah, just to end off with, I wanted to move on to some practical ways in which we can use diet to positively influence our gut microbiome. And the question is, what are we even aiming for when it comes to our gut microbiome? And really, one of the best analogies I can use to describe what we want to achieve is the differing approaches to agriculture that we have and the difference between mono and polyculture. Now, what do those two things mean? Monoculture is basically when one species or a crop is grown in an area, and polyculture is when there are multiple species that are grown in the same area. What I want to say is that monoculture doesn't actually exist in nature and is very much an artificial method introduced by humans, as it's financially more viable when we increase yields of one particular crop. And it also simplifies farming practices. But I think it's also important to recognize that for all the benefits, there are also some disadvantages that come with that, which include kind of a loss of biodiversity. You're losing kind of that mixture of crops growing in one place. You also have an increased need for chemical pesticides and, using these things to stop infection and pests. Because if you imagine if you have one crop and it gets an infection or a pest, it's going to wipe out all the crops that are grown on that same field. Whereas if you have different things growing in that area, they're not all going to be susceptible to the same infection or the same pest. So there's a much higher level of resilience when you have multiple different species. Also, different crops use different nutrients in different quantities. So again, if you have one crop, you're going to deplete the soil that it's grown in of particular nutrients. Whereas when you have multiple crops growing in that same place, you're going to have more of a balance and more homeostasis kind of in the soil integrity, because they're all using different things in different quantities. So what we want to achieve in our guts is this rich diversity that supports resilience to infection and pathogens. And as Gemma touched on earlier, each bacterial species plays a different role and has a different action in our gut. So we don't want one overpowering another. We want to kind of, achieve that balance between everything functioning as it should. So what can we actually do? Well, from the research that we have so far, we know that dietary fiber is the #1 indicator of our gut microbiome diversity. That's because there is carbohydrate present within those foods that can only be digested by the microbes in our gut. Our digestive system isn't designed to utilize those components of the food. The microbes are, and I don't really think that's a coincidence that there are foods that exist in nature that are only able to be digested by the microbes in our gut. I think that's how it's meant to be, and that these foods are incredibly important as part of our diet. If we consider that recent figures indicate that 1/3 of the UK population experience IBS type symptoms, this makes a lot of sense when you then look at the fiber intake of the UK population, which is about half of what it should be. So we should be aiming for about 30 grams of fiber a day as adults, and the average is about 18 grams, which is just over half. So while we may not be starving our bodies of food, we are effectively starving the microbes that exist within us and what they need to actually function optimally, which is this fiber and this, exposure to plant foods and whole foods. So I wanted to share this just as a really simple example of how we can kind of level up meals that we already eat to have more fiber in them. So to give you some kind of practical examples. So on the left-hand side of the slide is just some examples of kind of average meals that people would have. So porridge with some milk, a cereal bar for a snack, and then like sandwich and maybe some sausages and mash and some carrots in the evening time. Now that's a pretty common kind of type of diet, and that contains around 10 grams of fiber, which is well under kind of what we're aiming for. Whereas if you compare it to just making small tweaks, these aren't massive tweaks in kind of the diet. So for breakfast, having overnight oats, which is one of our second nature recipes, just by adding in some grated carrots, some bananas, some chia seeds, and some walnuts, you're kind of trebling the amount of fiber that's in that meal. Again, changing to a whole food snack, boosting your fiber intake. And at lunchtime, just by changing the type of bread that you use and adding in a vegetable soup, again, you are significantly increasing the amount of fiber that's in that meal. Again, at dinner, just adding some vegetables increases and brings your total intake across the day to closer to 40 grams of fiber, which is a significant difference from the diet on the left-hand side of the page. So I did just want to say that I know I work for the company, so you may think I'm biased, and hopefully in the chat, some people who are actually Second Nature members will be able to back me up on this one. But the recipes that we have are amazing, kind of on the program and in the book that we sell. They're so good, they're diverse, they're really easy to kind of incorporate into families. I use them. I have 2 small children, and we use them genuinely kind of on a weekly basis. So if you do want to check it out, we do just sell a book which is available on our website, or if you want to join the program, you will then get access to the wide network of recipes that we have on the app. And then, yeah, so one thing that can get confusing is whether eating lots of vegetables and plant foods has the same impact on our gut as adding fermented foods or foods with live microbes. And a simple way of explaining the difference is that plant foods feed our microbes, they keep them thriving and they keep them functioning at optimal levels. Whereas food that contains live microbes, like fermented foods, increase the bacterial diversity. So fermented foods may add beneficial bacteria to our gut, but we need the plant foods as well to keep them thriving and keep them surviving. So on that note, a question that we get asked a lot is, what are fermented foods? And they're basically foods that have undergone a process of fermentation, which can enhance the availability of nutrients within that food and also increase the probiotic or the live microbes that exist within that food. These foods like kimchi, kefir, sauerkraut have been a standard component of diets across the world for a very long time, but have recently been attracting kind of more attention in Western culture because of their ability to provide a source of live microbes. In Western culture, where the majority of our intake is largely made up of processed foods, as you can imagine, those foods have been heated, they've been sterilized, they've been pasteurized, they've gone through a lot of processing and basically have little to no resemblance of the original components, making it, we're basically not able to replenish good microbes within our gut from our diet. So this is where foods with live microbes, like fermented foods, can really play a part. But I did also want to say that it's worth saying that just because something is fermented doesn't mean that it contains live microbes, because if it has been heated or it has been cooked, so for example, like sourdough bread, which is baked, it will kill off a lot of the live microbes. However, that doesn't mean that it's still not a beneficial food to our diet, because a lot of research has shown that people are better able to tolerate foods that have been fermented, for example, like sourdough bread over standard kind of bread that you get in the supermarket, because during that process of fermentation, some of the carbohydrate components in the food are broken down, and therefore we're able to better digest it. So yeah, just wanted to kind of point out that difference. And yeah, so just wanted to touch on the topic of raw milk, which is receiving more and more attention as another source of live microbes in our diet. Raw milk isn't anything special. It's just essentially milk in its natural state. Milk is usually pasteurized to kill off any harmful bacteria and extend its shelf life. But in the process, we also remove some beneficial microbes that exist in the natural milk. I will say that it is still very much an emerging area of research, but this small study that was done in Ireland on 24 participants who went for 3 months to a farm didn't change too much about their diet other than changing to unpasteurized milk and dairy. the results showed that there was a significant increase in the abundance of beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus and also diversity within the gut. So it's very interesting to me that like fermented foods that have been used for generations and are essentially produced from a very natural process, reverting to the natural way of consuming milk could be something of potential interest. However, I do want to stress that when it comes to raw milk, the most important thing is sourcing it from a safe supplier that adheres to very strict hygiene procedures. I've been drinking raw milk for some time now, and I'm still alive. But there's a website there on the slide to locate safe suppliers that adhere to best practice for raw milk, for producing raw milk. This includes regular checks from the food standard agencies to test the milk and also test the cows for any infection. So yeah, if it's something that you're interested in experimenting with or looking into, I highly recommend that website for more information. And then another question you get asked a lot is whether someone should be taking a probiotic for gut health and to increase the diversity. Of course, it makes sense that if you're putting live microbes into the gut that you'll be increasing diversity. However, there are a few considerations to think about. The biggest one is whether you have core habits already to support the microbes in the long term. As we touched on earlier, fiber intake is what is needed to feed and support our microbes. So if you are adding in more bacteria, you need to consider what you're doing to support their survival. Also, as I'm sure you're all aware, probiotics are pretty expensive. So if you are wanting to use them for specific conditions, some questions to consider is, how much evidence is there out there for your specific symptoms? Which microbes have been shown to be beneficial? And that's down to the strain level. So again, looking back to that study I shared earlier on the anti-inflammatory effects of different bacterial species, different strains from the same family have been shown to have completely different impacts in terms of anti-inflammatory effects. So you really do need to get down to a strain level and understand what is an effective dose to make a difference and how long do you need to actually take that probiotic for. If you're not sure, then I would just recommend seeking out a specialist in the GI health sector for some support with this studies and research in that area you're looking to improve. And then, yeah, just to summarize, so the gut microbiome, as we've touched on, is linked to almost every system in our body, our digestive system, our immune system, our endocrine system, our nervous system. I call it the hub of our health because it's connected to absolutely everything. It's taking in information from our external environment on a minute-by-minute basis and then sharing that information with the rest of our body. So it is really a core component of our health. It is still very much an emerging area of research, but the evidence is showing that it could be a very useful modifiable factor in our health. And as Jemma touched on earlier, at this stage, there are definitely far more unknowns than knowns, and I would be very surprised in my lifetime if we understand and know everything about our gut microbiome, because it's so complex that I think that will be a forever emerging kind of area of science. However, I did want to say that even with the amount of unknowns that we do have, dietary intervention through higher fiber whole food diets and the addition of foods containing live microbes is showing really positive signs of being able to improve our gut microbiome function and also our diversity. And then just very lastly, I just wanted to summarize by saying, I know it can be really hard to take theory and wonder what actual impact it has in day-to-day life. And we are really lucky as health coaches to be able to see the real life impact every day when we work with people on the program to improve their dietary habits. Many people on the program join looking to lose weight or improve their blood sugar control and actually experience, so many positive benefits to their digestive health that they may not have even anticipated. Just some examples of some quotes there that were shared by some members on the program saying that, they've stopped taking all their medication, no more acid reflux. They no longer have IBS after 8 years of suffering with IBS type symptoms. And yeah, having one event of the IBS after 5 months of being on the program. So just some examples, we have loads of them, and it's, just amazing to kind of see the impact of just dietary and lifestyle changes. But I just wanted to share that to reinforce that change is possible. there is hope if you're looking to improve your digestive health. And that's it. I'll leave it there and hand over to some questions if we've had any come in.
Thank you so much, Marianne. That was very, very useful information. I hope everyone listening has found our presentation helpful in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, do we have any questions that have come through?
Thank you so much, Jem and Marianne. That was an incredible webinar. I've learned so much, and I'm sure like all of the audience did as well. It was a mix of practical advice plus evidence-based studies, etc. So that was really great, and we have so many questions. So a few people are asking if this is going to be recorded and sent by email, and I think
Yes.
it definitely is.
Yeah. So anyone who signed up and who is on the call right now will get a copy. But just to let you know that we do put every single recording on YouTube as well. So if you do have a YouTube account, I would recommend subscribing to us, and then you'll be able to get updates with any new videos that we put up on there.
So we have a really important question, I think, from Kim, who's asking if a high fiber diet is appropriate for colitis. Any thoughts?
I thought you were going to say something there, Marianne. So.
Oh no, there's a doctor called I would highly recommend looking up Dr. Alan Desmond. So he's a gastroenterologist, and he does a lot in the area of ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. And definitely from kind of research that he's done, it is possible to include fiber kind of as part of the diet alongside treatment for some inflammatory bowel disease. So yeah, it's very much, as with anything, it's very much an individual approach. And with kind of inflammatory bowel disease, it's very important to do any treatment that you're, considering alongside kind of the advice and the support of your gastroenterologist. So it isn't something that we can advise on the program because it's outside our scope of practice, because we don't have, medical backgrounds, we don't have information. So it is, I would definitely say to check out the research that Dr. Alan Desmond has done in that area, because he showed some really fascinating studies of using fiber alongside treatment and the impact that can have. But again, just want to caveat that with colitis or Crohn's or anything like that, it is very important to make any dietary changes with the guidance and the support of your gastroenterologist and your healthcare team.
I agree. And I was going to say as well, whenever you're making any sort of dietary changes, if you do decide to do it alone and you're not going to see a specialist, start small. I think a lot of people go in and they go all in and they start upping their fiber. It's like that example that you gave, Marianne, which is a fantastic example of like 10 grams of fiber in a day compared to 40. If you're going from 10 grams of fiber to 40 in a day straight away, you could notice digestive issues, and it, might not always be the best thing. So I would always say, just try and work through it slowly. Maybe start with breakfast and see how you get on with that. Also, I just want to say there's been a message in the chat that said, I wanted to say that after 3 months on the program, my acid reflux has gone. I don't need my tablets anymore. Amazing.
Wow.
Well done, Marie.
Awesome. We have Teresa asking, do you think vegetarians and vegans have healthier guts? Which I think is a really valid question. And I feel like yeah.
Yeah, do you know what? It's really funny. I was thinking about this question earlier before this was even asked, because a lot of people follow vegan diets, but they eat the same things a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
And it goes back to what I was saying in the presentation, that if you're eating the same sort of foods all the time, you're feeding a certain type of bacteria. Whereas someone that might, be eating meat and fish, etc., they might be getting these different nutrients in without even realize. So I would say, like, just because you're following a vegan diet doesn't mean that you're healthier.
Absolutely. And very often, like, a vegan diet doesn't mean you're only eating like veggies and fruits, right? Like, very often we have a lot of processed options, even when it comes to vegans. And something that might also be lacking in a vegan diet is omega-3 EPA DHA, which is what your body wants. And that's going to be really important for like inflammation, reducing inflammation in the gut, or like vitamin B12 as well, which you might like if you're a vegan, because that's the kind of things you would find in like dairy or meat. And that's also really important for gut health. So you have to be really intentional, like this, and like really try to include those foods via different sources or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think we have had Professor Tim Spector, we're very lucky we had Professor Tim Spector come and share some research with us for the Second Nature team. And I remember kind of one real takeaway that from that was from his research and his experience was that, you know, dietary quality was more important than kind of the dietary pattern that someone was following. So like we both said, just because you're vegetarian or vegan doesn't mean that the quality of your diet is higher than somebody who's potentially, you know, a meat eater. And so yeah, that's definitely, I would agree with you both there.
And also, I think it's inclusion rather than exclusion. It's not that we want to take anything out of the diet. When people, I'm sure you both get this as well when you're coaching members on the program, that people want to start cutting out all the things that they enjoy and putting random things in. And it's actually, you know, you can still eat what you want to eat. It's just about thinking, okay, what could I change in my breakfast, lunch, or dinner today to add a bit of diversity, to add a bit more fiber and a bit more, you know, more nutrients essentially.
Absolutely. We have one person asking, can you have too much fermented foods?
I want to say yes and no. I think it's a very personal thing. I think it goes back to what I was just saying earlier. If you've not had fermented foods before, start slowly and see how you get on. There's some research to show that like having them every day is fine. But again, I think it's quality and quantity of them.
Yeah,
And too
I
much
definitely agree
any,
with that.
yeah. And too much anything at the end of the day is harmful, right? Even water. So I'm assuming like if you have too much fermented foods, aka probiotics and extra microbes, that might also mean you might get an imbalance or things like that, because you want this diversity that Marianne was explaining earlier as well.
Yeah, and I think some cultures have been, you know, consuming fermented foods every day as part of their diet for a very long time, and it hasn't been shown to have any negative kind of health impacts at this stage. So, yeah, like I said, a balance of everything, but I definitely don't think kind of there's any harm in including fermented foods on a daily basis if your gut kind of tolerates them well and if it suits your natural constitution. But like Gemma said, it's just experimentation with your own gut and taking it slow and gradual.
For sure. And also be mindful of what fermented foods and drinks you're having, because some of them might appear, just because something is fermented doesn't mean that it's healthy. And you might pick up a fermented product and go, oh yeah, this is going to be great. And then you check the back of the label and it's got like 15 grams of sugar in it. So you still need to be mindful of what you're actually choosing.
Yeah, that is definitely something that is important. Like you made a really good point there, Gemma, because that's something that comes a lot, I think, on the program. I know for me and probably for both of you as well, that a lot of people consume, yeah, like fermented foods that has a lot of sugar in it. And if you think about it, kind of do the benefits really outweigh kind of the negatives then? Because if you're feeding kind of loads of sugar into your system, which is pro-inflammatory, and then feeding all the wrong type of bacteria, but then you're putting in kind of good bacteria, it's like, you know, what's the point? So definitely when it comes to fermented foods, I always say to people, if you can't make your own, like it's always preferable to make your own because then you have more control. Same with cooking. When you make something yourself, you have more control over what you're putting into it and the amount and the quantity. And, you know, you can know how much it doesn't get processed, it doesn't get heated, it doesn't get mass produced. So, and I think you have I think you have a better relationship with food when you're involved in the process. It's the same as making sourdough bread. So I just started making sourdough bread recently, and like,
Oh, you are
I
an
just enjoy the bread more.
absolute pro with that. You're so good with sourdough.
Yeah, but it's like an experience. You go through the process of making the food or any fermented food, and the enjoyment is so much higher because labor has gone into it. You've understood the process. You've understood if I do more of this, then this happens. If I do less of this, it's honestly it's such a nice process, and I think it can be the same with fermented foods. You start to understand if I put more of this in, you know, you get more life in the food, and yeah, I think it's a great process. So I would always say to anyone to try and experiment with making your own. That way you can control what's going into it as much as possible.
And it's probably cheaper as well in the long run.
So we have a really good observation from Lorraine, who's telling us that she has been issues with her gut that have been caused by antibiotics over the years, and she didn't know there was a link between the gut and mental health. So do you want to talk about that? Because I think that's a really, really good one, especially after, like, Jem, you said like
Yeah, it's
90% of your serotonin is crazy.
honestly, it changed the game for me. When I first started learning, I only really started doing proper research into gut health about a year and a half ago. And I just couldn't, for me, I couldn't believe, I think as a professional, how it wasn't spoken about more. And you think I've had all this training, I work in the role, it's not something that's really spoken about. So if I don't hear about it, how is someone that, you know, has no nutritional knowledge meant to hear about this when actually, oh my goodness, like it has a huge, huge, huge impact on us. As I said in there, like the gut-brain axis, the gut and the brain are working independently, but they're also working together. And it's that bi-directional link of, you know, what we're eating is going to have a direct impact on how we feel. It might not be straight away, but it's like I say to people, you know, you can't have one meal, like one healthy meal, and then think that you're going to feel better in yourself. It has to be a constant thing. You have to be focusing on those daily habits and looking at it as a whole as well, because alongside diet, it's your habits as a whole, right? So it's like your exercise, how much are you moving? All of these things are going to help to stimulate serotonin and dopamine, and they all feed in together. But I think the fact that the majority of the serotonin is created in the gut just amplifies how important it is that we protect our gut as much as we can.
Love that. There's a lot of questions around gluten-free products, especially oats, and people are asking if they're the same as like regular oats, or like how do we handle like gluten-free diets and trying to get as much fiber, right? And I think like there's so many other sources, right? Like I think there's different types of oats as well. Like there's like like roll oats and stuff like that. Can you correct me? Right? And I think that like the rolled oats are the best ones when it comes to fiber. Am I right?
Sorry, go on, Marianne, I thought you were going to say.
No, again, I think you can like look at the labels. The fiber content is written kind of on all the labels. So if you go to the gluten-free section and kind of if you're wondering kind of which ones would be best to add to get that fiber content into your diet, then I would choose, yeah, the highest fiber option available. But as you said, kind of there's loads of different kind of varieties, and there's lots of
You
naturally
have quinoa.
gluten-free food.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Quinoa, whole
there's
grain
lots of,
rice. Like there's so
yeah,
many
yeah,
options
there's
there.
loads of,
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah,
I think
vegetable, fruit,
and also like gluten-free options as well. You think gluten-free foods are just one part of a huge part of our diet, and there's actually so many different ways that we can get fiber in the diet that have nothing to do with gluten. So yeah, definitely worth having a look at the back of packets for sure and seeing the fiber content.
Could you recommend any natural or dietary probiotics? I think kefir might be like a really good one. You mentioned Marianne about dairy, but I think like kefir is a really good source of probiotics.
Yeah, I think with yogurt, try and make sure that it's got the live bacteria in it, because I think a lot of people are under this like a misconception that every type of yogurt that you get will have live cultures in it, and that's not the case. So for me, I use Fage. It looks like it's spelled Fage, and it's got a few
I've said
strains
fish for
added.
so long.
Fage. It says it on the side, so pronounced Fage. But I use that for my breakfast, and I mix it with kefir, so I'm getting like double the amount. And that in itself works really well. And I think because like price point wise, like it is a little bit more expensive than getting like Aldi's own, but mixing it with the kefir, you're kind of doubling it up. You're doubling the amount of probiotics that are in there. We've got the fermented food as well, and then you can go with that. But yeah, I think that's good for breakfast or snack for sure.
Love that. And on the same note, we have someone asking us that they've heard that when we increase our probiotic intake, we have to increase the prebiotics.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah. Go ahead, Marianne.
So yeah, that was just kind of referring to that earlier slide kind of on fiber being important. So fiber is, so yeah, it's a complex term because prebiotic basically just means the fuel for the bacteria that live within the gut. So fiber is the prebiotic material that we want to include in our diet in order to keep the good bacteria thriving and kind of surviving in our gut. So by having kind of a lot of whole foods, fiber, as we said, oats, whole grain bread, fruits, vegetables, all natural foods will feed those microbes that live within our gut and do that prebiotic effect so that you get kind of a nice diversity of thriving kind of bacteria within the gut. So sorry if that wasn't clear. Yeah, prebiotics is referring to kind of the fiber in our diet, those undigestible fibers that the gut uses to, develop and thrive, basically.
Love this.
Hopefully
We
that
have someone asking a really, really good question because I'm sure there's so many people relating to this. So that person has IBS and they have been prescribed different medication and nothing seems to help. And they've been told to avoid milk products, and that contradicts the information that we just gave. And I think this is so relevant because when it comes to IBS, even eating onion, eating garlic, eating a lot of fiber, that can actually worsen the symptoms, especially things called food maps. So do you want to maybe like give your hypothesis on why this is happening and what they can do about that?
Yeah, sorry, I never know who's going to talk.
Like, always wait those few seconds. I'm like,
yeah, so obviously in terms of the medication, I don't know, I can't comment on kind of the medication side of things because I don't know what medication kind of we're referring to here. But yeah, I can, firstly, I'll say kind of everyone is different. So like I said, what suits one person's constitution is not necessarily the same for somebody else. But when it comes to specific foods that cause irritation within the gut, what often is more of an issue in my experience is it's not so much the food is an issue, it's often that the gut wall or the integrity of the gut is somewhat compromised. So yes, a solution is to cut out the food that causes you the most irritation and you feel better, but actually often there's root underlying issues going on underneath all of that there's inflammation within the gut or there's bacteria in the wrong place in the gut that needs to be kind of balanced out. So in this scenario, I would always recommend kind of seeking out kind of support from somebody who's a specialist in the area of GI health and kind of really looking at the root cause of what may potentially be causing an issue. Because what we don't want is, cutting out lots of really good foods like fibrous foods and vegetables that are super nutritious and dairy products and that sort of thing forever, and you're kind of eliminating some really good nutritious foods because they cause you discomfort. I can totally understand not wanting to be in discomfort and pain. Of course, that's natural. So removing them for a short period of time and then seeking out kind of help to get more further investigations into what is actually going on underneath the surface would be my best. In just my experience, that's usually more the case than somebody is, allergic to milk or something like that. It's actually that your body is just not able to digest the milk in the way that it should be, and that needs to be kind of the focus area rather than just cutting out heaps of food. And that's what the FODMAP diet is. It's kind of eliminating a lot of things that cause irritation, and then slowly kind of bringing them back to kind of see which ones are the most, I guess, the ones that cause the most irritation to the gut. But yeah, if you can figure out the underlying root cause, then I think that's the better long-term solution so that you can then enjoy those foods in moderation and not have that same response.
I also, to add to that, I think keeping like a food journal can be really, really useful as well. I think a lot of people don't realize this when they're getting gut symptoms or they've got IBS, and because everyone's got different trigger points and different quantities that might create different triggers, which will then create the symptoms. And I would say always like write down like when you get an attack or when you like just really feel poorly, what did you eat leading up to that? What did you eat that morning? What did you eat that afternoon? And kind of feeding into that. But also going back to what I was saying in the presentation as well, is that try to look at it from a holistic approach too, because while diet plays a key role, you know, what's going on for you mentally? Are you feeling stressed? Are you feeling anxious? And I understand that, you know, having physical discomfort can actually cause these mental disturbances. But is there something else going on that maybe could be causing these physical impacts on you? So I definitely recommend having a little think about that as well and seeing.
I love that. I love what you said, Jem, about stress having an impact as well. Sometimes we think it's just the food, and yet it's many other factors, right?
And I actually think a lot of us we go through this like constant flight or flight, and we're always stressed and we don't realize that we're stressed. And I speak to so many people on the program who experience discomfort and digestive discomfort. And when you get to the root of it, they're having a really stressful time at home or at work or things. And, you know, you get them out, they start going for walks, they start looking after themselves in different ways. Next thing they're going, oh my God, like it's cleared up a bit. So yeah, definitely looking at it from a more holistic route can be useful for sure.
And even like having practices like meditation or things that stimulate that vagus nerve and kind of make you more relaxed can really help the IBS symptoms sometimes. But I just want to just like mention something regarding milk, because that person was talking about milk, and sometimes it's just that you don't have the enzymes to digest the milk. So in milk, there's like something called lactose, right? So a type of carb. And you need that enzyme called lactase to be able to digest the lactose. So sometimes like it's just a matter of talking to your GP about maybe like having a look at this and maybe like supplementation, but you would need to speak to like your healthcare provider obviously before this.
And luckily, there's things like they do lactose-free milk now as well.
Yes, I
So
know,
that,
it's
you know, and
amazing.
I do think you think, God, like 5 years ago to now, they cater for a lot more. Even people who are celiac or people that are following like gluten-free, there's so many more options than there were a few years ago. So it does make it slightly easier, but still hard to actually understand. Based on the comments that I'm reading through from everyone, it's like people understand it, but people are still confused. I hear you. I hear you. Like it is very confusing, but we want to try and digest it, excuse the pun, as you know, as easily as possible. So, you know, if you do have any questions after this or something doesn't make a lot of sense, you can reach out in our communities, you can speak to one of your health coaches, pop me an email. I think anyone who's signed up will have access to my email. So if you do have any questions, we can collate them and like get back to you and help you with that.
So we have again a few comments around bloating, and I feel like a lot of people experience this. And again, it comes back to Marianne's point earlier about like experimenting, which what makes you more bloated, and Jem's advice about like keeping a diary. And I know that if you go see like a specialized dietitian, they might make you do something called an elimination diet. So they're going to try to eliminate certain foods and then like reintroduce them to see how you react to different ones. But I think that's more of like a personalized approach. Because what might work for me might not work for you, and that's not something that you can just give like general advice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely, I would say as well that the fermentation process in the gut is a natural process. Like we are constantly fermenting digestible, undigestible carbohydrates in our gut. So a byproduct of the fermentation process is gas. So you will get kind of as a natural response to eating kind of whole grains and plants, you will get some gas release. So a little bit of bloating or a little bit of wind is not kind of anything to be, you know, massively concerned about. Of course, if it's causing you discomfort or it's excessive or anything like that, then that's something to be concerned about because you can be getting gas produced in the wrong part of the gut. So those are things definitely to be investigated. But I would say like a little bit of gas production from eating plants, because a lot of people say like I eat beans and then I get gas production, and that's normal. Like that's a normal thing that happens as part of the physiological process that happens in our gut. So I wouldn't worry unless it's causing you discomfort or pain or it's abnormal or changes or anything like that. Then I would definitely, you know, get that investigated. But yeah, it is a normal process as well.
Absolutely. And I think just to finish up with one last question, going through the chat, trying to find it now, it was basically around including alcohol. And the reason why I wanted to finish with this is because I think that this is something that a lot of people struggle with, is including alcohol and if it has an impact on gut health. And like, you know, the short answer is yes, if you drink too much alcohol, of course it can have an impact on your gut health because it is a toxin. But depending on the type of alcohol, so something like red wine and dark beers, they contain polyphenols, which are actually good for our gut health. And I think some research has shown that if you have, say, like one of these a day, that's okay because it's anti-inflammatory. However, if you then start dipping into 2, 3, 4 drinks, that goes from being anti-inflammatory to pro-inflammatory. And that's when the leaky gut, that permeable gut that I was speaking about and we've spoken about tonight, can start to happen. And, you know, it's like when it gets into your bloodstream, then it can have negative impacts on your health. So I would say be mindful with alcohol. Don't overdo it. Of course, yes, it's got polyphenols, but it doesn't mean you should drink it all the time. So I think take it as you would with the general alcohol advice, and yeah, moderate.
Yeah, I would add to that if you do have problems kind of with alcohol in any kind of context, it may be worth looking, as we discussed in the webinar, at like your core habits and your core dietary habits first, and kind of trying to incorporate as much whole foods and whole grains and those prebiotic type foods into your diet to try and kind of boost the gut microbiome, and then kind of experiment again, as Jemma said, with a little bit of alcohol, because what can often happen is if you do have inflammation in the gut, as you can imagine with any inflammation, if it's red and inflamed and then you pour alcohol onto there, the response isn't going to be great. It's going to, you know, have an inflammatory type response. So if you can kind of calm down the gut, kind of consider all those facts that Jemma mentioned, such as stress, your environment, you know, what state you're actually in, what does your diet look like, how much plant foods do you have in there, kind of make adjustments there, and then experiment with a little bit of alcohol after that, you might find that the response is different. So looking at those core habits and getting your gut kind of really strong and robust is the first place I would look at. And then, yeah, you can always experiment with it afterwards. But you're absolutely spot on that, you know, a moderate amount of alcohol on a gut that's, you know, well balanced shouldn't have too much of an impact if it's enjoyed in moderation.
Yeah, that is great advice. The last thing you want to do is fight fire with fire. So it's definitely worth looking at your habits as a whole. So I am conscious that we have gone over time and I know that people will have to leave. If anyone, I just saw that Louisa's left a comment in the box. If you do have any questions that haven't been answered, please feel free to pop me an email and I will collate them and get back to you. But I hope you've enjoyed tonight's webinar. I certainly have enjoyed presenting instead of just hosting. It has been really nice. And thank you so much to Zara and Marianne as well. It's been, yeah, great webinar. Hope you all have a lovely evening and we will be back soon with another one for you.
So much. Thanks, bye.